Okay, can you hear me? Good.
Yeah.
Do I take that as my hint to get started?
Yes.
Very good. Well, finally, welcome everyone. Glad to have you join us for our Greater Lansing United Nations Association Java Cafe this evening. Our speaker is Wenona Singel. She is a associate professor of law at Michigan State University in the College of Law and the director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center. Professor Singel's research and writing address issues related to tribal sovereignty and indigenous rights. She is currently writing a book called Indian Removal, Past and Present that describes the intergenerational impact of federal Indian law and policy on Native families, which weaves in stories of multiple generations of her own family's experience of forcible Indian removal in Michigan, land dispossession at Burt Lake, Michigan, attendance at Michigan Indian boarding schools, and removal of children from their families and placement into foster care and adoptive homes. Professor Singel served as deputy legal counsel for Governor Gretchen Whitmer from 2019 to 2021, advising on tribal state affairs. She held several judicial roles for many years. She is the former president of the Michigan Indian Judicial Association, and she serves the National Council on the National Council of the World Wildlife Fund. Professor Singel is an enrolled member of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indians, and she is a descendant of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, the Burt Lake Band of Ottawa Indians and Chippewa Indians, and the Grand River Bands of Ottawa Indians. A first-generation college graduate, she holds degrees from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. I had a chance to chat with her beforehand, and a wealth of information and very interesting. So I'm looking forward to her talk, and I know you will enjoy it.
So much. Annie Boujou, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I do want to represent the Anishinaabemowin language in Michigan, the indigenous language in Michigan. So I'll introduce myself. Wenona Singel, Indigenous, Maingan and Dodam, Wabnang Nakwejang and Dayan Nongum, Waganakasing Odawa and Dayan Nongum. So I just want to say that my name is Wenona Singel. My clan is the Wolf, and I'm from Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, but I now live here in East Lansing. So I am truly honored to be here, and also I want to acknowledge that this is an area of special important interest to myself and many others at the law school and at MSU and in our community. But I don't claim to be a leader in terms of Indigenous representation in the UN system. And so I do, of course, want to acknowledge the incredible long-term commitment of folks who represent Indigenous nations and peoples from around the world, including in Michigan. So in Michigan, the former chairman of my own tribe is Frank Adewegishek, and Frank has long been a very, very active member of U.S. Indigenous representation before the UN system, attending meetings all around the world for the past several decades. And so he's a wonderful, wonderful source of knowledge. And a few years ago, he was the co-chair of the Indigenous Caucus of the UN. So this is a photo of an Indigenous peoples meeting on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I assume I'm beginning from the point of assuming that folks may not have much knowledge of Indigenous peoples generally. So I wanted to give some basic statistics. So there's an incredible wealth of diversity throughout the world of Indigenous peoples. We have almost 500 million people around the world who identify as Indigenous, and that represents over 6% of the world's complete population. Furthermore, those persons are located in 90 countries around the world, and they represent over 5,000 distinct groups or cultural groups and over 4,000 indigenous languages. And so over half of the languages around the world are indigenous languages. And so much of our cultural diversity around the world comes from indigenous peoples, but also, as you will see in terms of the environment, so much of our biodiversity around the world is located within territories that are indigenous territories. And so if we want to protect our environment and we want to protect our world against the changes that we're seeing as a result of global warming, we need to respect the rights of indigenous peoples and support them in their ongoing millennia process of stewardship of their own lands. And so I'll talk about that dynamic toward the end of the presentation as well. So I also want to acknowledge that a lot of times people say, well, you're giving statistics about the numerosity of indigenous peoples around the world, but how do you define who indigenous peoples are? And in fact, that's a really difficult definition to nail down. And the United Nations adopted a declaration called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UNDRIP, which we call it. And noticeably and remarkably, the UNDRIP does not specifically define who constitutes indigenous peoples. And that's because there is controversy over the precise boundaries that we might want to create to identify who's within the population of indigenous peoples and who is not. And so the definition I'm about to give you is general, but it's not necessarily a universally agreed upon around the world. And that's also because one of the defining rights of indigenous peoples is also self-identification. And so oftentimes when we talk about trying to adopt a universal definition for indigenous peoples, we might actually be adopting a definition that conflicts with how one group might want to self-identify their own indigeneity. So when I talk about indigenous peoples, I'm generally referring to people who are the descendants of populations that live in countries that have experienced conquest or colonization. And so they're not always, but frequently they're minority, marginalized populations within countries, but not always. And then also, these populations also retain distinct cultural, economic, and social and political institutions. So by that, I'm referring to the fact that cultural institutions can include the fact that indigenous peoples have their own distinct languages, their own distinct form of spirituality and form of ceremony and customs and beliefs. And furthermore, they have their own, an extension of that exercise of culture is also the way in which they engage in sustainable practices that support their livelihood. And so that can include traditional means of stewarding their territories and using the resources in their territories in a sustainable way. And so that is often a fundamentally important part of the economies of indigenous peoples, and certainly one that has been forcibly interrupted and forcibly limited by colonization through, for example, in the US, as you know, in US history, we had massive attempts to kill off wildlife, including bison, which were important sources of food resources for Native people in the plains. And so, and also, of course, we have many, many indigenous populations that rely upon fisheries as an absolutely critical part of their economies, of their livelihoods, but also an important part of their spirituality and their culture and ceremony and beliefs. And through overfishing throughout the world, we've seen the collapse of fisheries and important and significant obstacles to the ongoing viability of fish populations that have required, dramatic efforts to restore the environmental criteria that are needed to sustain fish populations, such as removing uh, 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 fish passageways, removing bridges that create culverts that make it impossible for salmon to reach their spawning grounds, for example. So by Indigenous peoples having this diversity, I'm referring to all of these different kinds of forms of diversity. Another important aspect of the term Indigenous peoples is that I'm intentionally using the plural S at the end. And that's because I'm not referring to individual Indigenous people as, just millions of individuals who statistically we'd want to identify as individual people. We're talking about populations that identify as collectives, populations that have a collective shared form of culture and self-governance and economic modes of providing for their own sustenance and well-being. And so that's why we intentionally refer to Indigenous peoples, to ensure that we're referring to them as collectives, not just as individual members of those groups. And so I wanted to show you this diagram, which I think is really fascinating because it's a map that shows the world's Indigenous peoples. So I'll start with the US, where it says that in the US, we are estimated to have 6.6 million Indigenous peoples, which is quite significant. If you look at Greenland, it says 56,500, but it also says of Greenland's inhabitants, 89% are Greenland Inuit. And so I think that's really important to note because one of the questions that I was just discussing with Bob before the talk today was whether I'd address any of the actions of the Trump regime. And in fact, there's been a lot of talk about the US attempting to acquire the territory of Greenland. And I think it's important that we recognize that that prospect is a direct assault on Indigenous rights, given that the population is 89% Inuit in Greenland. But you can also see that in terms of where are there concentrations of Indigenous peoples around the world, in China, we have over 125 million Indigenous peoples. But I also want to acknowledge that it's really hard to have accurate statistics regarding the numbers of Indigenous peoples that exist within these countries, because many countries, in particular Russia and China, for example, they don't want to necessarily acknowledge the extent to which a certain percentage of their population is Indigenous, because they see the recognition of Indigenous peoples as a threat to their own ability to engage in unilateral decision-making regarding exploitation of natural resources, for example, and unilateral decision-making over dispossessing people of their lands. And so to the extent that they do acknowledge Indigenous rights, then they're also more publicly accountable for the violation of those rights. And so that's why, many countries do not want to acknowledge or would not agree on the numbers of Indigenous peoples that exist within their countries. And so also I think that I wanted to emphasize that in terms of Indigenous peoples around the world, their relationship to the land is so critical. Indigenous peoples are place-based peoples because rather than, for example, although certainly as a product of colonization, many Indigenous peoples have been, have a history of missionaries coming to their communities and converting their ancestors to different forms of Christianity, for example. So we have a lot of Catholic Native people. We have a lot of different denominations. But at the same time, traditional forms of Indigenous spirituality are generally very place specific. And so the forms of spirituality, the beliefs, the terminology, the words, the ceremonies, the songs, the traditions, the expectations for members of the community, gendered expectations, expectations based on age and seniority and age in the community. It's all bound up in the land and practices that are relevant to that specific territory that those indigenous peoples are from. And so when we talk about the Anishinaabe, for example, who are, many of whom are in the Great Lakes region, we're talking about a form of spirituality that at its core values and respects and teaches core values and beliefs regarding the importance of water. And so you will have ceremonies and songs, and you will actively participate in honoring and respecting and sharing the water in a spiritual way, in a sacred way. And that water is unique, and those teachings are unique to that particular place where these indigenous communities are located. And so similarly, if you talk about indigenous peoples in the Southwest of the United States, for example, they will have, a form of spirituality that recognizes the sacredness of mountains that surround their traditional territory. And they will have stories, and they will have teachings and ceremonial practices, and they will have required activities that you must participate in to pass through adolescence and to pass through the different phases of life that are fundamentally related to the resources and the places that are available in that particular location where those indigenous peoples are located. So that's why land is so important. You can't just completely relocate indigenous peoples without fundamentally destroying an important part of their ability to pass on their culture to the next generation. And so indigenous peoples protect at least 28% of the Earth's surface. That is huge, considering that they are just over 6% of the world's population. So a hugely disproportionate amount of the world's surface area is indigenous territory. And in addition, there's an incredible amount of biodiversity within the territory that indigenous peoples with where they live and their traditional territories that they continue to manage today. And I mentioned those deep cultural and spiritual ties. So I have another map I wanted to show you. This is a global map of lands that are managed or controlled by indigenous peoples. And these numbers at the bottom show us the percent of the shaded lands that are managed or controlled by indigenous peoples. So the darkest areas that you see, for example, in West Africa and in the area of Russia, for example, show us that we have areas in Greenland. 1 to 100% of those shaded lands are managed or controlled by indigenous peoples. And so that also shows an incredible presence of land that is actively managed or controlled by indigenous peoples around the world. And also, if you look in the US, we don't have those huge dark red areas, but we have a lot of lands and territories that have really critical resources that are within what we call Indian country under federal law in the United States. And also, just because an area is not shaded and it's white doesn't mean that there are no indigenous peoples there. It might mean that there wasn't enough data for them to be compiled for this particular academic article that was published in 2018. In addition, I think this is an interesting diagram because it shows us that for each area that is what we call an anthropogenic biome, or an area that is human altered, to what extent are those lands in the world indigenous peoples' lands? So if they're indigenous peoples' lands, then they are shaded brown. And if they are not indigenous peoples' lands, they're yellow. So you can see that for urban areas around the world, almost none of it, right? It doesn't look like any of it is brown or indigenous peoples. But look all the way down to treeless and barren lands, almost half of it seems around the world is identified as indigenous peoples' land. And you can see that we see really significant indigenous people presence and management of lands, including rangelands, woodlands, inhabited wild woodlands, croplands, and rain-fed croplands. And so I just wanted to highlight the diversity of the different kinds of areas around the world that this particular study identified as being indigenous. And then in addition to that, I also wanted to give you a brief introduction to Indigenous peoples and the United Nations. So I really first should start with the fact that Indigenous peoples have long engaged in an effort to participate actively in our international community. And so that began, or at least we tend to commemorate it as beginning in 1923. So does anyone know what happened in 1923? It wasn't even, the UN didn't even exist then, right? So we had the League of Nations. And at the League of Nations is meeting, and Chief Deskahey from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy from the United States went to the meeting, and he wanted to, participate in the meeting, but was not able to actively participate, not able to use his own papers, and his papers, were not viewed as being a valid form for international travel and for, coming through across international borders. But he felt that when he knew that there was a League of Nations in this international community, he knew that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy members had sovereignty too, and that they were nations. And in the US, we also recognize that we have three separate sovereigns: the federal government, the states, and the tribes. And so each tribe in the United States is clearly recognized, even in the United States Constitution, through the structure of what we call the Indian Commerce Clause. Tribes are on the same, in the same sentence as references to states and foreign nations. Three groups: tribes, states, Indians, states, and foreign nations. They're all three separate sovereigns that are recognized. And then furthermore, we have a long tradition of negotiating treaties between the United States and tribes in the US. And you don't negotiate a treaty with an entity that is not a sovereign. And so it's very, very common for tribes in the US to refer to themselves as nations. The Navajo Nation that refers to itself as a nation. The Cherokee of Oklahoma refer to themselves as the Cherokee Nation. In Michigan, we don't have tribes whose federally recognized name includes the word nation, but it's still an incredibly important understanding that all tribes in the US have nationhood, have sovereignty. It's a form of self-governance that they always possess since time immemorial. That means that it never was a gift from the federal government or a delegation of power from the federal government. It was always a power to exercise self-determination and to govern themselves according to their own laws and institutions since time immemorial. And that furthermore, even though colonization has stripped away some of that and limited some of that, it's never taken it all away. And so in the US, we have a very strong, relatively strong recognition of tribal sovereignty. However, it's only reserved for tribes that have what we call federal recognition. And we have 574 tribes in the US that have federal recognition. Around the world, Indigenous peoples also, in the international community, we recognize that they have self-determination. They have a right to engage in self-government. But domestically around the world, countries around the world are extremely inconsistent in the degree to which they recognize that Indigenous peoples have the right to exercise inherent sovereignty, a sovereignty that predates the existence of that country that they've never lost and allows them to engage in self-governance independently. So So from 1923, we had Chief Desgahay come to the League of Nations, or attempt to come to the League of Nations, and who was unsuccessful. And I was fortunate to attend a meeting of one of the bodies of the UN that's dedicated to Indigenous rights. It's the expert mechanism of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it meets every July in Geneva. And the year that I was able to participate happened to be 2023. And so it was the centennial of Chief Desgahay's attempt to participate in the League of Nations when he was rebuffed. And so it was fascinating because the city of Geneva has these canals. It's on a lake, and it has these canals in the city with these bridges over the canals. And there they have flags for, Swiss flags hanging from all of these light fixtures on these bridges. But they changed all the flags so that they were flags of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And they had a huge public event to honor Chief Desgahay, and they had representation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, of course, at formal recognition of them at the meeting of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, recognizing that history, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have come a long way in their fight and persistence to be a part of the UN system. That said, it's been a really long, difficult, arduous process. And so initially, there were attempts over decades of representatives of Indigenous peoples who fought to participate in the UN system, and who also wanted the UN system to develop some document, if not a treaty, then a declaration that would acknowledge the rights of Indigenous peoples, because Indigenous peoples have experienced significant forms of discrimination, and they wanted a document that protected those rights of equality, but also that recognized their unique recognition that they are collectives, that they are peoples with nationhood. And so one of the processes and one of the bodies that the UN system developed in the course of Indigenous peoples' activism in the UN system was the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And so that Permanent Forum is a forum that now meets every year, every April at the UN in New York City. And so at the Permanent Forum in April, it lasts about 10 days long. And we have Indigenous peoples from all around the world who come and participate. And every year there is the Permanent Forum consists of a formally appointed body of representatives from around the world. But then in addition, Indigenous peoples from around the world also can participate, and they have the opportunity to come to all the different aspects of the agenda and the different topics that are designated for discussion related to the theme of that year's Permanent Forum meeting. And they can make a public statement and submit in writing their statement as well. But because there's so many Indigenous peoples from around the world, each statement, which is called an intervention, is limited to 2 minutes. And so you have people who came from a whole delegation celebrated by their community, and they've fought maybe for years for the ability and the money, the incredible financial resources it takes to travel to the UN to participate. And they get 2 minutes to make their statement and to submit their document for it to be entered into the record, and hopefully to be part of a variety of voices on that similar theme that can then shape the actions that are recommended by the individuals who are officially appointed to the Permanent Forum. So it's really difficult to feel that you're really making an impact. And sometimes that makes some folks from Indigenous populations say, why do we spend thousands of dollars to send you to that? If you just got, we're all watching the UN TV, UN YouTube, and we saw you get up there for 2 minutes. But the reality is that it takes sustained, engaged participation So it takes participation, not just at one meeting, but across years of meetings. And furthermore, a lot of times, and not a lot of times, all the time, the actual deal making and negotiations and the progress, the incremental policy progress gets made outside of that room. It gets made in the hallways and in the lines to the cafeteria, the line to the coffee shop that's outside that room. And then also you'll have NGOs that represent Indigenous issues from around the world, and they all come to the UN and they create their own side events. And so throughout the entire 10-day period of the Permanent Forum's meetings, you'll have a separate agenda of side events. And those side events are dedicated to topical issues that may be very timely, and they'll bring in experts from around the world. And so you'll have a chance to converge and discuss shared experiences of Indigenous peoples and shared objectives and goals for Indigenous peoples. And that's also one of the really fascinating and important ways in which Indigenous participation in the UN has led to these incredible breakthroughs in our knowledge. One is that the experience of colonization has so many shared aspects around the world. And so when we talk about in the US and in Canada, we talk about the experience of Indian boarding schools. I mean, in Canada, we call them the residential schools, where children, Native children, were taken from their families, frequently without their parents' consent, so stolen from their parents' families and institutionalized for their childhoods in schools where they were often not taught true academics, but taught menial tasks like how to do laundry. And then furthermore, these children, we know now, have reported horrific examples of physical and sexual abuse, child neglect, psychological abuse, malnutrition. I know that there's one academic study in Canada that showed that an Indian residential school in Canada was intentionally depriving children of food and giving them vitamins instead as part of a study to determine the efficacy of vitamins as a substitute for actual nutritious food. And there's a panel discussion of elders who lived in this school when they were children. And they talk about how hungry they remember being and what a horrific time that was in their life. And then they talk also about their peers who aren't alive anymore because they've committed suicide in their adulthood, and how angry they are that they went through this and that the government didn't do anything about it. And so these stories are horrific, and a lot of times we're only learning about them decades after the children experience them because there's so much trauma and shame that oftentimes our elders don't talk about it until maybe once more people start talking about it, like with Deb Haaland's, the Secretary of Interior's Road to Healing, it became more open and acceptable to acknowledge what someone had experienced in the boarding schools. So what's fascinating is that we're learning that Canada experienced something just like we experienced in the US with our Indian boarding schools. And then we know that Australia had boarding schools. And we know that, the Sami attended boarding schools, and that removal of children from their families and placement into institutions was described in the US as a means of killing the Indian and saving the man. That it was this idea that we could completely acculturate all Indigenous identity for Native people, and that they would then be able to assimilate into society as white people. And that this was part of a shared strategy and policy of nations around the world in the way in which they adopted policies impacting Native people. And so it's incredibly empowering for Indigenous people to come together and talk about these shared experiences, to learn about the parallels of the strategies and techniques that were used, the parallels in terms of the effects that it caused for their communities, and then to talk about what are we going to do about it? What are our strategies for remedies? And it's so empowering to be able to connect with people from around the world and share those ideas. And it's not just, of course, the history of boarding schools or the history of the mass removal of children and placement into foster care and adoption, but it's also the extractive resources within Indian country, and it's the damming of indigenous peoples' territory in order to provide control flooding and to provide water resources for non-indigenous communities, often completely omitting the development of infrastructure and resources to allow indigenous communities to have access to those same water resources. So this is so that's one of the really important effects of Indigenous participation in the UN, is coming together to learn about our shared experiences and our shared commitment to finding solutions and strategies for remedies. And so we have the permanent forum, we have the expert mechanism, or MRIP as we call it, that meets in Geneva. And we also have what's called the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And while the permanent forum and the MRIP are several individuals who are appointed to each, the special rapporteur is just one person. And that one person has the ability to field requests for interventions around the world by indigenous peoples. And then they have the ability, if the country where those indigenous peoples are located consents, then they can go to and meet with those indigenous peoples and collect data and document the experience of them if they're describing violations of their human rights. So that's very important. Furthermore, the expert mechanism is considered has a unique role to play because these are folks who have the power to also describe not just what is happening for indigenous populations around the world. They do that too. They travel around the world and meet with indigenous peoples, but they also are deemed to have the power to identify emerging forms of international customary law. And so the more that we have nations around the world acting in a consistent way with regard to indigenous rights and indigenous peoples, coupled with the belief that they have a legal obligation to do so, the stronger the case we can make that we have a growing body of international customary law that allows for more accountability in terms of violations of indigenous rights. So these three bodies are incredibly important, but also we're always struggling with a lack of resources. And so, some of the most wealthy indigenous populations are in the US, and we still have a paucity of representation of US tribes before these bodies. We still have, like in Michigan, when former chairman of my tribe, Frank Edowagishik, attends all of these meetings around the world, like he's involved in, not just these three bodies. He's going to WIPO, and he's discussing intellectual property issues, and he's discussing food and agriculture and development, and and then he's discussing climate change. I think that what I'm trying to say is that there are lots of different ways that people engage in the UN, but these are the three bodies that are specifically dedicated to indigenous issues. Beyond them, indigenous peoples participate in every other body as well, in every other convening. So you have a Paris Convention. Indigenous peoples, of course, are present, but it's so expensive and so difficult. So what I was saying about Frank Edowagishik is that when he goes, he pays for himself. The tribe doesn't pay for him, and he's the executive director now of United Tribes of Michigan, which all 12 tribes that are federally recognized in Michigan are members of United Tribes. They don't pay for him to go to these international meetings. He just pays for it out of his own pocket. So if he has to do that, and he's a national expert who's widely respected, he's an indigenous person. If he has to do that, and he drives like a beat up minivan, he's not somebody who has a lot of wealth to be traveling all around the world, but he makes it happen because he's so committed to this. And so you can imagine how hard it is for people throughout the US, but around the world to regularly, consistently participate so that they can really make sure that their voices are consistently heard and have an impact. So it's really, really difficult. And there is actually a fund that's supposed to help pay for some, the UN has a fund to pay for some Indigenous representatives to attend, but it's very, very limited. So chances of, being able to benefit from that are really, really insignificant. And so I know that a friend of mine, actually one of my roommates in law school, she works for one of the US's largest law firms and is the chair of their Indian law practice group. And so one of her clients is called the COLT, the Council of Large Tribes. And so these are the largest tribes in the US. And so they pay her law firm, big law firm, big law rates per hour to go travel with them and assist them in their engagement with these bodies. But it's incredibly expensive for them to do so. And they get really angry and frustrated when they attend and they realize they only had 2 minutes. Or sometimes there's so many Indigenous peoples representatives from all over the world that there might be an agenda item for the permanent forum that was dedicated 3 hours. And you would think that almost everybody would have a chance. No. And so you'll have tribes like maybe the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, like a huge tribe that in fact never even had a chance to state their intervention, never got their 2 minutes of airtime before one of these meetings. And then they're incredibly angry and frustrated. And then my friend comes to me and says, oh my God, I'm completely going to get fired by my client. They're so angry with me. What can I do? And what people are trying to do, I can't take credit, but like another really close friend of mine is working on an effort to has created a guidebook for Indigenous participation in the UN to really help educate in an accessible way how to engage in that long-term process of participation so you can make a difference and not just go to one meeting and then get angry that you didn't get your 2 minutes for that one agenda item. So so I'm not done. Because I also wanted to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and also the some of the concerns that Indigenous peoples have had. And so as you know, I know that you've been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals in other meetings. So of course, you know that they've been adopted. They were adopted in 2015, and there's 17 of them, and they relate to a variety of topics such as eradicating poverty and education and gender equality, and, for example, and promoting action to address climate change and to protect clean water. Well, what I want to say is that, of course, Indigenous peoples are absolutely engaged and committed and very, very relevant to these Sustainable Development Goals. And I shouldn't have to make the case for that. It's quite obvious. They have, because of their significant management of biodiversity around the world, they have a very important role to play in protecting biodiversity, and also climate resilience is incredibly important. Oftentimes, Indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And furthermore, Indigenous peoples have what we call traditional ecological knowledge, this traditional knowledge that they've possessed and passed on over the millennia from generation to generation about the various interaction of biodiverse species within their environment. And they have, because their traditional practices are so detailed, they easily identify and can help identify for others when there's been a change. And when these processes that are all interrelated in terms of the seasonal changes and agricultural growth every season and the migration of species every season, when there are changes, they notice it immediately. And so oftentimes they're really, really valuable resources for sharing that traditional ecological knowledge, and that's absolutely relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals. Furthermore, of course, it's important that we respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination, Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and self-determination, in the process of trying to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So given that, I want to acknowledge that while the title of my talk is called Partnership for the Planet, I think that that creates a little bit of a sense that everything is, that there's no conflict, that it's, everyone's really pleased with their engagement and the collaboration that tribes have been involved in, that Indigenous peoples have been involved in, and that's not true. So Indigenous peoples have been very critical of the kind of limited participation that they've been allowed to have in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, and they've also been very critical about the impact that reaching the Sustainable Development Goals can have on their communities that might further the transition to a green economy, but might nevertheless have unique harmful impacts for a particular community. So for example, the transition to a green economy often includes a recognition that we need to promote more electric vehicles. Well, if we want to promote more electric vehicles, we also need more access to rare earth minerals. If we need more access to rare earth minerals, we might need to engage in more mining in areas that haven't been as critical for mining development historically. And a lot of those locations are in Indigenous lands. And so the Sami Youth Council submitted an intervention before the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous People saying that we were experiencing threats to our communities and dispossession and loss of our resources and lands as a result of the increased demand for rare earth minerals that are located in our territories. And so your attempt to achieve a transition to a green economy is having unintended collateral harmful consequences for us locally. And we want further global recognition of the need to protect our rights. We shouldn't be sacrificial lambs in the attempt to promote a green economy. And so some of the other criticisms that have been levied by Indigenous peoples include that their participation was a mere form of tokenism, and that it wasn't actually, they didn't have the opportunity to have their voices and their input shared in a way that it could meaningfully contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they don't just want the appearance that they're there so everything looks good. They want to actually contribute in a way where their input changes and makes modifications to those goals in a way that respects their rights. And in addition, they're concerned that as we work to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we might be taking actions that where countries say, hey, we're working toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, so we're going to unilaterally decide to use our lands and resources in our nation this way. And then there are Indigenous peoples who say, wait a minute, we have the right under international law, under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which technically is just a declaration and not a source of international law, but nevertheless, Indigenous peoples will say, wait a second, the Declaration says that we have a right of free, prior, and informed consent anytime a nation attempts to extract resources on our lands or use our lands that are in fact our traditional territory. And this is really, really difficult, particularly in nations where the country never got around to formally titling the land that Indigenous peoples occupy. I wonder why they wouldn't do that, right? Because the ambiguity benefits them. And so when they don't formally title and they don't formally acknowledge what particular areas of land are the Indigenous territories, that gives them an opportunity to make unilateral decisions about how to use those lands and how to develop those lands in a way that may be harmful to Indigenous rights. But in addition to that, there are also concerns that the Sustainable Development Goals focus on meeting those goals in a way that measures broad-based statistics of populations as a whole, but that doesn't disaggregate those statistics to focus on how they're benefiting or not benefiting specific Indigenous populations. So they're saying, don't just say that, 20% of this country has been impacted in a positive way because of our attempts to meet the Sustainable Development Goal. Instead, focus on the fact that maybe 20% of, the non-Indigenous folks have benefited, but only 3% of the Indigenous folks have experienced a benefit, but many have experienced a harm. And so they want to ensure that data collection reflects their communities and how they're experiencing the effects of reaching these goals. And so in addition to that, I mentioned the transition to a green economy can mean demand for resources in Indigenous territories, but so can conservation. So a lot of times we think, well, how is that harmful? Well, actually, even in the United States, the setting aside of our national park system involved massive dispossession of Native people from their homelands. And so this, of course, as other countries around the world are also designating areas for conservation, whether for national parks or for other conservation purposes, that often means that they are excluding Indigenous peoples from their own traditional territories in the name of preserving these lands. Well, we should recognize that Indigenous peoples have, for millennia, been the stewards of these lands, and they have techniques that have been honed for millennia and knowledge about how to manage those resources. We shouldn't allow for, we should certainly have accountability, and we should be willing to recognize and respond to instances where there is dispossession. And there's actually been instances where the dispossession as a result of conservation has led countries to hire, what's the word I'm looking for? Private military entities to go in and move Indigenous peoples off the conserved lands, resulting in violent conflict and even resulting in allegations of genocide as a result of that. And so that's a significant concern as well. And so finally, I want to emphasize that ultimately, at bottom, Indigenous peoples want respect for their inherent sovereignty. They have a power of self-government, a power of self-determination that they have always possessed since time immemorial, that predates the existence of the country where they're located, that they've never fully lost, and they want they want their right to engage in that self-governance and live according to their own laws to be respected. And so of course, they want to participate in the reaching of sustainable development goals, but they want to do it in a way that respects their sovereignty, their autonomy to make choices about their own lands and resources, and the laws that they deem appropriate to protect the well-being of their own communities. And so that's really the most important lesson that you could draw from this. So with that, I want to say Chimigwach. Thank you so much for your interest in the topic today. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay. So now I can go to the last slide. It's the thank you one. Thank you. Oh. So does anyone have questions? Yeah, go ahead. Right. So that has to be the product of a consent-based, agreement between tribes that they should, maybe form a coalition and that they can have, representatives speak on their behalf. And so when I mentioned the Coalition of Large Tribes, or COLT, in the United States, they decide for themselves, and they actually will frequently say, no, there's, five tribes are coming to the UN, and 5 tribes are going to have a representative that's going to make us an intervention and make a statement for this part of the agenda. So, a tribe or Indigenous peoples decide for themselves if they're going to speak on their own behalf, or if they're willing to allow some other representative to speak on their behalf, because maybe they have a shared concern and they've formally formed some kind of coalition, and they feel that that's a better way to show the force and of the both the facts of what they're experiencing and the form of accountability that they want to reach. Yeah. Others? Yeah. Countries? Yes. Oh, okay, okay. So the question was, around the world, are there some countries that are better at respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and that are considered more progressive? And so I think that, it really varies across the world. And, for example, you have Denmark and Greenland, right? And they certainly want to protect the rights of the Indigenous peoples in Greenland. But I'm not an expert on the history of the Inuits' experience of being colonized within Greenland. I do want to acknowledge that one of the ways that Indigenous peoples are active and relevant throughout the whole UN system is that with our Human Rights Council, we also have a process called Universal Periodic Review. And so every country that's part of the UN system on a rotating basis is up for its participation in the Universal Periodic Review process. And as part of that process, there can be concerns related to how that country may be violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. And when they are up for discussion, any country can make a comment or criticize or demand to know more information about these allegations of violations of rights within that particular country. So that supports accountability. Given that, I think for a long period, even though we have a deeply, deeply flawed experience of colonization in the US, and there's been tremendous numbers of, atrocities in US history and violations of Indigenous rights. The US also has taken significant steps in its modern history in the 20th century to recognize and enforce treaty rights in our judicial system, and that's been really important and effectual for the exercise of treaty rights in the U.S., which means the ability to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded territories described in treaties. But in addition to that, the U.S. has also passed a number of laws. And so we have been in an era called the self-determination era in the U.S. And the U.S. Congress has passed dozens of federal statutes that have supported the financial resources available to tribes and tribal legal systems and tribal law enforcement. They've supported increasing autonomy for tribes in forestry and mining, but they're also massive failures as well because, for example, many tribes in the Southwest have long not benefited from the historic attempt to articulate water rights that the states were able to grab for themselves, and the tribes were omitted from that process historically. And now you have tribes in the Southwest that are still attempting to get an adjudication of their water rights in the U.S. So, the U.S. has serious problems because the populations in the U.S. that are most likely to have lack of access to flowing water in the household are Indigenous communities in the U.S. So we have extreme problems in the U.S. too, but we also have a lot of strengths. And one of those strengths is that within our constitutional system and within our judiciary and through acts of Congress, we have repeated affirmations of tribal sovereignty as being inherent and respect for tribal self-determination. And in Canada, there has not been the same strong recognition of the self-determination of tribes. And there's a different history of the history of what's called the Indian Act in Canada. But First Nations in Canada have been treated more like municipalities under non-native law that are exercising a form of non-native law. And so you have First Nations that are still saying, no, we're exercising our own inherent sovereignty as Indigenous peoples. We're not wearing the cloak of a local government under this particular province. So there's a lot of unevenness around the world in terms of respect for Indigenous rights. I would say that, of course, countries like China and Russia are horrible at respecting Indigenous rights. Interestingly, Russia does have active participation in these UN bodies, and they even have individuals who are Indigenous who are leaders in these bodies and regularly participate. And so I think that there's some strategy to this because on the one hand, Russia's been very active in supporting Indigenous representation on the UN system's work to recognizing the importance of Indigenous languages. And so there's been a decade of the recognition of Indigenous languages. And so we've had a lot of events and a lot of resources dedicated to documenting the importance and the significance and the diversity of Indigenous languages and the importance of retaining that knowledge of those languages and passing them on and teaching it. But is Russia active in discussing the harmful effects of mining on Indigenous territories? Absolutely not. And so I was at another conference once where, the community I'm thinking of is close to St. Petersburg. I think they're called the Kerala. But of course, you also have in areas of Russia that are closer to China, you have Indigenous peoples whose territories are rich in natural resources that the country wants to exploit. And so I was at a conference in the US in upstate New York where someone said, I'm living in exile because I'm from those communities and I'm speaking out against what I see as a genocide. I'm seeing a slaughter of my people. I'm seeing murder of my peers in the community. I'm speaking out against it, but I can't go back to my country or my community because if I do, I will be killed by the state. And so on the one hand, you see Russia trying to publicly say, oh, we're so good at respecting Indigenous languages. But on the other hand, they're silent regarding any acknowledgement of this aspect of their engagement. So there can be a lot of inconsistencies and hypocrisy for every country. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm.
This Aryan race theory in South Asia. South Asia has been started that when Aryans came from Central Asia,
Mm-hmm.
they pushed down.
Mm-hmm.
Down, down, down.
Yeah.
I, I get
Mm-hmm.
the the anecdotal recall being this week somehow years back. There were some people also like in the study civilization who they have been terminated, who then also like some lesser
Mm-hmm.
the possible way. So when we found the common ground, because even as he know in the both why nations fail, they also feel that why this colonial project took off and why not others took off.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the indigenous people also, because of the population, customs and ritual power.
Mm-hmm.
This, America is a nation. Why is it a nation? Because of also the indigenous people, the way they were organized. So
And you also spoke about the fact that we have a special relation to the land. I mean, while the colonizers who came, they actually believed in this 5% in the tribe, our land ownership. While they just believe in the commonness of the land. So if we why not find a common ground? Because ultimately this roundup will continue to be there and this issue will continue to raise.
Yeah.
Because even I probably call myself son of soil, I get confronted. So there might be some other people.
Yeah.
This might be cyclical.
So yeah, so the question, as I understand it, is that this really gets to the heart of the controversy and the difficulty of reaching a universally accepted definition of who constitutes Indigenous peoples. Because there will always be folks saying, well, so you say that you were here, for this amount of historic period of time, but actually, 3,000 years ago, prior to that, there was another indigenous population that was here, and the group that is now recognized as being indigenous peoples from that territory, they moved in and they had violent conflict and they took the territory of that earlier community. And so there are folks who say, for example, in the Great Lakes region, well, we had the Miamis in southern Michigan and we had the Wyandottes, and we also fought the Iroquois. And so there was migration of Anishinaabe people west and migration east, and the Potawatomi, who are now in Hannibal Indian community in the Upper Peninsula, they didn't start there, but they were in the Great Lakes. But we have tribes that are now in the US located in areas where they may not have originated, but because they were fleeing violent confrontations with the federal government. And so we had forcible removal in beginning in 1830 and continuing through 1840 in the United States, including we had forcible removal here in Michigan. And so we had Native people who were displaced and moved as a result. And so some might say, well, I challenge your claim that this is actually that you're on a territory that you have possessed since time immemorial. You've actually been migratory people yourself. And, your presence on that particular territory was preceded by a different population. And so isn't that then proving that it's nearly impossible to really identify with certainty who's truly Indigenous and who isn't? And can't we always problematize one group's claim to indigeneity to a particular territory? And so that is a challenge. And that's part of the reason why we don't have a formal definition in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of Indigenous peoples. But I think that part of the response to that is that we shouldn't abandon the effort to acknowledge that there is a phenomenon of Indigenous peoples who exercise sovereignty, who predate the existence of today's colonizing countries, and who experience an important pattern of shared form of discrimination. It's a shared form of dispossession of property rights. It's a shared form of violation of rights to culture and education, and of discriminatory law enforcement practices. I mean, in the U.S. criminalized every form of indigeneity. You couldn't have long hair, you couldn't have a powwow, you couldn't practice your religion. There were courts of Indian offenses in Indian country where the goal was to appoint individuals that were going to police Native people to prevent them from being Indian. And so I think that today we have a really complex universe of Indigenous peoples around the world who are not necessarily in the same place where they've always inhabited. And we have like the Bedouin, for example, who are migratory people, but who also have claims to indigeneity as well. So it is complex, but I think because of the history of the shared common forms of discrimination that Indigenous peoples have long experienced for centuries, that there's a benefit to saying that we should focus on Indigenous peoples as populations that experience these shared forms of common discrimination and violence, because the only way that we're going to reach effective forms of accountability and protection is if we articulate the harm as a common form of harm experienced by Indigenous peoples. And if we attempt to find ways of avoiding it, redressing it, mitigating it, avoiding it, by reference to Indigenous peoples. And that if we're going to talk about, just eliminating discrimination on an individual basis, we're going to avoid lots of the creative mechanisms and ways in which Indigenous peoples have always been targeted in the US. I teach federal Indian law to my students, and it's a hard class because a lot of my students are Native themselves. They identify as Indigenous, and we have to read cases for 2/3 of the class that are just outright completely racist, that describe Indigenous peoples as savage, as lacking in intelligence, as uncivilized, and as people who couldn't handle themselves around alcohol and needed to, have prohibitions from alcohol in their community. And so, and that in fact, those beliefs were so central to federal policy that one of the cases in Supreme Court history that is the foundational case for defining who is Indian and who is not is based on the fact that one of the Pueblo communities, they were considered, drunks and uncivilized and people that couldn't manage their own affairs. And so that's what made them Indian. That's how the government knew they were Indian, because they had those weaknesses, those inherent weaknesses as a community. And so because it wasn't just a form of singling out one person and discriminating against one person because of their own actions. It was a form of discrimination against the whole community, against their whole culture, and singling them out as an Indigenous population and saying, we're going to treat you differently because your culture's inferior and your knowledge is inferior. And so that's why I think articulating rights as applying to Indigenous peoples is really valuable, because it gets at that dynamic. Yeah.
Pointed question, but I don't audience. So I'm a professor of Eastern European history and Michigan State. So a long time ago, I authored something called the Annual Country Report on Human Rights for Ukraine. So I also want to bolster what you're saying. Despite all the shortcomings of the United States, we actually, every mission around the world reported on the state of Indigenous rights in Annual Country Report on Human Rights. And those are being, I'd say, jeopardized under the current patients to what the state.
Mm-hmm.
So I reported on the Indigenous rights of Ukrainian subjects. To your comment about the sort of linguistic rights under Russian rule within the Russian Federation, but also under Russian occupation of Crimean United States is fundamentally being curtailed. So people, Crimean Tatars are not really allowed to enroll their children in Crimean Tatar schools. They exist formally, but they're much to become a huge source of population that you cited in your brief commentary are the Karelian Finns.
Yes. Yes.
The Karelian Finns exist on territory that the Soviet Union took from Finland as a result of a war that occurred in 1939 and 40. So it's land that was taken away from Finland, and so in many cases the Russian Federation has to acknowledge the linguistic rights of this population as sort of matter of foreign policy against the Karelian. So say that we are a greater defender of these linguistic rights, growing Finns and themselves. So it's a sort of strategic.
Right.
But my question is this: is so Crimean, the current Minister of Defense in Ukraine, the man who's responsible for the Ukrainian defense of Ukraine is Crimean Tatar. There are other Crimean Tatars who exist
in the Ukrainian parliament as well. So I guess I'm interested in most certainly these mechanisms in the UN for redress of Indigenous rights. But to what degree are Indigenous rights part of the formal delegations of states to the United Nations? That is, to what degree do Indigenous people have influence on the states' delegations, the
Yeah.
general assembly?
Incredibly
So, particular
difficult.
to the American example,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, this is actually not a when actually not a people have influence over US delegations.
Right. It's incredibly difficult. And with the Biden administration, oh, sure. I'll repeat the question. The question is, there's a lot of background context provided regarding Ukraine, but the question was, oh shoot, now I'm going to get lost. But right. Oh, right. Yes. Right. Mhm. Right. So thank you. Thank you. So the question is, do Indigenous people have a really difficult time working with their country representatives that participate in the UN system such that their interests are adequately represented? And it's incredibly difficult. And so even in the history of, administrations in the US in recent decades that you would think would be really friendly to Indigenous peoples, we didn't make the kind of strides we were hoping for in terms of strong affirmation of Indigenous rights. Now, we did formally sign on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples a few years after most other countries had signed on to it. So there was a delay, but we did during the Obama administration. But in the US, Indian Affairs or Tribal Affairs is largely relegated to the Department of Interior, which of course used to be the Department of War. And the State Department is separate from that. And there's a lot of disconnect between policies of recognizing Indigenous issues and advocating for solving those Indigenous issues in Interior versus addressing them and within the State Department and being able to communicate those issues in an informed way in international affairs through people that work in the State Department. And so I know that in the Biden administration, one of my very good friends and close colleagues from University of Colorado, Kristen Carpenter, worked very hard with Secretary Haaland and Assistant Secretary Brian Newland from Michigan, and one of my former students at MSU, and to collaborate with the State Department and to get the State Department to more strongly embrace representation of Indigenous issues before the UN system. But sometimes even the actions that the State Department was willing to take seemed symbolic more than meaningful. They felt that they looked good, but did they really move the dial to effectively change reality for Indigenous peoples? I think there was a lot of dissatisfaction in that regard. And so if we have that challenge in the US and Indigenous peoples have incredibly compared to other countries, we have a lot of resources at our disposal to effectively lobby federal agencies and to impact their decision-making processes. Imagine the difficulties that Indigenous populations, Indigenous peoples are having around the country in other domestic contexts in terms of, getting fair representation. Now, given that we do have outliers like Bolivia, we have countries that have adapted constitutions that affirmatively respect Indigenous rights and commit the countries to a form of pluralism that's intended to respect Indigenous rights. But even in those circumstances, oftentimes it can be difficult to get beyond the surface level strong affirmation of rights in the actual legal documents and translate that to enforcement and accountability on the ground so that it actually can be a basis for meaningful recognition of rights and meaningful remedies when those rights are being violated. So there's can be a difficulty in translating those important legal advances in some countries that are more strongly protective of Indigenous rights. And in terms of, their access to influencing the federal government's participation in the UN system, that might ebb and flow. It might change depending on local domestic politics and who's elected president of the country and whether that person, has the political capital to invest in making, in directing their agencies to take meaningful action in representing Indigenous peoples before the UN. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times countries are not prioritizing those rights and they're working on other issues. But what we're also seeing is, until, of course, the Trump regime changes everything, but we're also seeing a greater likelihood that even something like a trade agreement would include provisions that required respect for human rights. And that could be another way to protect Indigenous rights as well. But I don't think the U.S. is going to be a leader in that regard during this current administration. Thank you. All right, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody on Zoom. Appreciate it. Okay.
Any other?
That's why I was just saying that, as I mentioned, it's so important for, even if a bunch of different groups of Indigenous peoples got together and said, we're going to try to all use our 2 minutes before the permanent forum to really make a mark on this particular issue. That's important. But as I was saying, that I don't want to also diminish the importance of what happens outside the room. The deal making, the relationship building, and the side events that the NGOs are organizing, and that Indigenous communities can organize themselves to address the issues that are really timely and of most importance for them, where they can find common solutions, and then try to use that whole, convening of people from around the world to bring together, folks to find common solutions. All right, Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, are we still online?
Yes, they are still online. So for the further announcements, yeah.
Yes, yes, we have a.
Yes. But also we would love to of the United Nations. Like to be there.
Yes. So thank you so much.
Take care of.
Thank you again, Winona. Very much appreciated. But to remind you that we do have a statement from our president here, so I want to invite our president up. Were you, I believe you're going to mention about their membership? Yes. So, y'all, if you aren't a member, we have our, or those online, we do have opportunity for that as well. So, yeah.
Well, first of all, wonderful presentation. Very informative. I learned a lot tonight. Thank you very much. Excuse me. As you see from the slide up here about GLUNA's mission, I wanted to emphasize to you that it is very important for the community to understand what the UN represents and also to know that it's possible to join an organization, which is the United Nations Association, which is worldwide. The one that we're particularly involved in is UNA USA specifically. And our local chapter, our mission is to provide through education and advocacy information to encourage the community to learn about the UN and to support it. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of benefits to becoming a member. I won't read every one of these, but we have special events. We have UN Day in October every year. And we also have through email information that will keep you informed about the United Nations Association, about the UN, and the UN News, which covers information about all sorts of issues around the world and what the UN is dealing with at the present time. Next one. So you can become, and we encourage you to become a member. We have some new membership categories that just started this month. One is young professional, which is 18 to 30 years old. And the yearly dues are $25. And the UNA National Office is allowing the first year of a young professional membership to be free. And then after that, it would be $25 each year. We also have Gen UN, that's a new category also, for persons 14 to 17 years of age who care about global issues, who want to be involved and understand about the UN and what's going on in the world. Fixed income, $25, and that's for persons who have limited income or low income, but would like to be engaged and involved. And then the standard membership of $50. You can go on our site, the gluna.org, and sign up for membership. And when you become a member of our local chapter, you also are becoming a member of the national UNA USA. So we encourage you to connect with us, come and enjoy our activities, which we have on a regular basis, like the wonderful presentation this evening, and become informed about what the UN is doing, sustainable development goals, which the UN is trying to accomplish over a 15-year period ending in 2030, and to see what you can bring to the table as an individual and to your community. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so very much, Denise. I've been a member since 1997, I believe, and I think it's a very important part of my life. And I've learned so much over the years being a part of this and just getting to know the other people who are involved in the United Nations Association. It's a great community. And so I hope that you'll really consider that. There is information over on the table there as well if you wanted a piece of information to take home about membership or other things about the UN. I think there's also cards there of information about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an interesting card to have if you don't already have that. That lists all 17. I think that's it to this point. To wrap up, we have refreshments. I hope that you'll take time to have refreshments. Stay around, chat a bit. We got until 9 o'clock before we got to be out of the room here. No,
Well, the library closes at 9, so. I think that.
it always drags out longer than you think. So 8:35, we'll shoot for that. So we got plenty of time though for a little time to chat. If you have further questions for Wenona, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you. I'm just amazed with so much to learn and just the challenges that Indigenous peoples face. And I know the UN does so many great things, but also there's always challenges there to be heard and to get your point across, and also to be heard by the more powerful nations who are in the UN. So we're glad that there are groups like the Indigenous nations that are part of that, and those peoples who are helping, trying to hit their voices be heard and make the UN be more effective in the world. So thank you for that, Wenona. So thank you again. Have a good night.